Dear journalists, hello. We'll talk about culture, war, and responsibility of individuals. And our guests are Ralston, Saul, President of PEN International, Mykola Riabchuk, President of the Ukrainian Center of the PEN International, and Andriy Kurkov, who is Vice President of the Ukrainian Center. Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming. It's very pleasant to sit among presidents and vice presidents, but it's all because tomorrow there's the first International Literature Festival in Odessa at an unprecedented level for Ukrainian festivals. Co-organizers of the festival are Ulrich Schreiber and Hans Schuber. They are directors of German and Swiss international festivals, and it's due to them and due to financing from European sources. There will be dozens of international writers from Europe and Asia. The Ukrainian Pen Club takes part in this festival. There will be discussions, some of them under the patronage or of the PEN International, the protection of rights of writers and journalists, issues of the protection of rights of journalists, and tolerance towards others' thoughts and opinions. I give the floor to Mykola Riabchuk, head of the PEN International in Ukraine. I'll be almost as concise as Andriy Kurkov because our main character here is John Ralston Saul, of course, and I'll just tell you a couple of words about the Ukrainian PEN. It's a rather young organization compared to International PEN that's been in existence since 1921. We've been created only in 1981. Previously, our writers could be members of PEN International, but there was no PEN Center in Ukraine. So after it's been created, the PEN Center in Ukraine was in a rather sleepy condition. When we rehabilitated it after the victory of Mr. Yanukovych as president, and the initiative group of writers decided that we should resuscitate this PEN in Ukraine. I am very, very glad that our guest agreed to stop in Kiev. He's got a very intensive program. He came from across the ocean and seas. Tomorrow morning he goes to Odessa, and today at 6 p.m. we have a round table in Kyiv-Mohyla Academy in English. It will be of a rather theoretical character. And now I'll give the floor to our guest, who will, I think, introduce the organization that he represents and will probably dwell upon why he's here and about the problems that today PEN Club faces.
Thank you so much. Concise, because Andriy picked me up at the airport about an hour ago, and I just arrived from Africa, from Mali, from Bamako. So I'm a little shaky. But let me first say that I think that this festival in Odessa is a very important statement. People often wonder, what happens when there's disorder or war? What happens to freedom of expression? What do writers do at that point? And we do many things, but in fact, the role that we have to play becomes increasingly important because, in a way, our job is to keep the word functioning and to keep it as much as possible out of the hands of propaganda, a very, very difficult task on all sides in times of war, and just to prepare a way for people to speak to each other all the way through, to show that it's possible for people who at the political level are involved in war or conflict, that in fact this is temporary, however horrible it is, and at a certain point people will be able to talk to each other. And so over the last, since these particular troubles began, we've organized a series of meetings across Europe, bringing together Ukrainian writers and Russian writers like Ralston, Kurkov, and many others, to show in public what language sounds like, what non-panicked, non-propaganda, non-fearful language sounds like, leaving or showing that civilization actually can exist in times of trouble. And let me just say about, so this festival in Odessa is extremely important because, as Andriy says, it brings together a very high level of writers from around Europe and elsewhere. It will, in some ways, of course, be conscious of the situation, but the very fact that people are there, the very fact that they might talk about, I don't know, love or, you know, petty problems that might turn up in novels, shows that life exists through literature and that people have their lives, and that this statement of normalcy, to use an American made-up word from the 30s, is essential. So PEN International, I'm the elected president of the international organization. This organization is the original civil society organization, modern civil society organization. We invented it in 1921. There were no others. And since then, our idea has spread. There are now millions of them. And it started in England by people like Joseph Conrad, H.G. Wells, Galsworthy, George Bernard Shaw. And within 2 years, it had spread all over Europe. And in fact, within 10 years, it was in Japan, it was in Buenos Aires, it was in Montreal, it was in New York, and so on. Today, there are about 30,000 members, every Nobel Prize winner, as well as thousands of people that one has never heard of. They're in 110 countries, organized into 150 PEN centers. In 10 days in Quebec City, our 81st Congress takes place, when you'll have about 400 or 500 writers who, theoretically, we have 3 official languages, English, French, and Spanish. 80% of our members don't really speak those languages. It's an organization filled with Asians and Africans and South Americans, and, you know, the Argentinian PEN Center, the president is Luisa Valenzuela, the greatest writer in Argentina. The Nicaraguan is Gioconda Belli, the greatest poet probably in Central America. The American Center's president is Andrew Solomon, one of the great writers out of New York. So it's a very interesting combination of the world's leading writers and people who are on the margins. And who do we defend? Because we're about literature and freedom of expression, because they're exactly the same thing. There's no such thing as freedom of expression without literature, or literature without freedom of expression. Of course we defend our members, but we're not a union. We're not a syndicat. We defend freedom of expression. So today there are about 850 writers on our list of writers, journalists in prison. And for example, you just had a press conference about Oleg Sentsov. I don't think he's yet on our list because people thought that he's a filmmaker and therefore why would he be on our list? But actually, PEN is filled with famous filmmakers and screenwriters. And one of the things now that I've been focused on it is I'll go back and say, why isn't he on? Well, it's actually up to Ukrainian PEN to get him on your radar, and then you'll tell us to put it on our radar. And then a campaign will begin at the international level of writers around the world, I would think. So there are about 850 writers in prison or in danger around the world. We have this sort of list, which is the only list which is kept up. So all the other organizations come to us to look at this list and contribute to it. It's very hard to maintain this information. You imagine 850 campaigns at the same time without the budget of a government and without a secret service to collect the information, right? What we have is, of course, 30,000 writers on the ground, which means that when someone's arrested, we usually hear about it the very day. And one of the things we've discovered is that if we get the information within about 3-4 hours and start a rapid action campaign, in 50% of the cases, we can get them out on the same day because the bureaucrats haven't yet started formalizing the process of them going to trial. So speed is of enormous importance. And it's a little bit like preventing a stroke. The faster you get to the hospital, the easier it is to reverse it. But the other thing which is really worrying, and it applies here, is that more and more we find that authorities are either so bored with freedom of expression, so confused about how to stand up to people like us, that they're simply killing writers. And so that if you go back about 10 years, very few writers were being killed. I mean, they hadn't been killing writers for a long time. Put them away for life, but don't kill them. Now there are over 200 writers being killed every year, and it's growing very fast. And many of them, I have to say to you, are journalists. And so we've had to reinvent how we campaign, because very often they're unknown journalists in provincial newspapers, and we don't know about them. So how do we actually create a campaign in a country which will try to force these governments, often corrupt and so on, to act in a way that these writers will not be killed? So we've had to become much more complex in our approaches, many more delegations. I've just come back from Honduras, been 3 times to Mexico with large delegations of writers to try and, I don't know what the right word is, almost bully the governments into taking action. And funnily enough, I'll tell you, in many parts of the world, the leading force calling for law and order is pen. Because if you don't have an honest police force and an honest judiciary, they can kill us, they can put us in jail, they can shut down freedom of expression. We need the justice system to work. And in fact, yesterday, in a very interesting meeting with all Francophone writers from throughout Africa, and they were talking about the terrible war in Mali, which is where it was, but also Chad, also you go through the countries. And a number of the writers were saying, you know, you can't have a society that functions if you don't have justice. And you can't have justice if you have high levels of corruption. And so, you know, in this area, you could say some of those same things, that at a certain level of corruption, the justice system cannot function. And if it doesn't function, the citizens will not respect the institutions of the state. And if they don't respect the institutions of the state, you're on the way to various forms of violence and breakdown of freedom of expression. So, I could go on and on because you can imagine the kind of work we're doing. But I'm thrilled to be here. This is my first time in Ukraine. But as a Canadian, I never say this normally as international president, obviously I have a particular interest in Ukraine. And on top of that, I come from the prairies, which is where there are a large part of the Ukrainian Canadian population. So I've always wanted to be here. And it's too brief in Kiev, but I'll have about 5 days in Odessa. So thank you very much, and if there are questions.
Thank you very much. Are there any questions or clarifications? Чи є питання або уточнення? Then I would like to ask a question myself. As a person with literature background, I'm very thrilled to hear that the international attention on Ukraine will finally be on something different than military actions and reforms that are, you know, constantly being talked about here, especially at Ukraine Crisis Media Center. Could you elaborate a bit more, but that's probably the question more to Ukrainians, on the festival that you're having? How many days? When does it start? What will you talk about? Who's coming? How many people?
Ну, якби як ініціатор фестивалю я відповім на це запитання.
The initiator of the festival, I'll answer this question. There will be almost everybody who is anybody among Ukrainian writers, including Sergei Zhadan and the Dogs, so he'll also sing. There will be several locations in Odessa, Terminal 42, the Literature Museum, and a number of other places like Londonska Hotel. There will be Yurko Andruchovich, there will be authors from the USA, Bulgaria, Germany. So we will have practically the entire Europe represented and the closest Asia. I don't want to get mixed up with surnames, but there will be quite a lot of everybody. There will be Viktor Yerofeev from Russia and the legendary writer from Russia who lives in Switzerland. You know, Viktor Shishkin, who refused to receive the biggest prize, literary Russian prize, after Russia annexed Crimea. People will read their works in English and there will be translation. The festival starts tomorrow and it will last for 4 days. So far, it is, we plan to make it annual. So this is the first time that Ukraine sees such a festival. Yes, understood. What about the future? You maybe haven't thought about the future, but were you thinking about doing this in other places of Ukraine, like in smaller cities? You know, it is an international festival and it is already called the Odessa Festival, because, you know, to stage a European festival in Mykola would be rather hard, because you have to have a place where something like 1 million people live, and a place which has its legend of its own, because no one knows.
But you know, if you can, if this festival can be stabilized, established and stabilized, what happens always is that the organizers start saying to the writers, well, now you're in Ukraine. Would you be willing to stay 2 extra days and go into schools? Would you be interested in going to nearby towns? Would you come first to Kiev before or afterwards to Kiev? I mean, the whole literary festival thing, it rolls. Once you got it going, usually there are people saying, well, we want them. And then you say, okay, well, you paid to get them there, or how will this happen? And it starts spreading around the country. And of course, people are very curious. I'm not the only one, and people are very, very curious. They want to see parts of the Ukraine that they haven't seen, or to see something they have never seen before. So I think if you can establish it, if it works this year, and there's support from the citizens who come and hear and take part and say things, then it'll go on and it'll get bigger and bigger and it'll spread from Odessa outwards. Is that right?
Так. Є, ну, інший приклад, тобто ми 2 роки тому робили перший фестиваль.
There are other examples. A couple of years ago, we staged the first Ukrainian Literature Festival in Innsbruck, Austria, and then it happened, it became clear that we could also speak in Munich and Salzburg and Vienna, and this year we will probably spread into northern Italy, because they now know what's happening, and it takes only 2 hours by train to Innsbruck. I want to share my optimism about the future, and my example is that every year I go to Forum 2000 in Prague. This is a great international event, and many people from different countries come there, and they share their opinions and thoughts, but still they go to, of course the main events are in Prague, but they go to other cities as well. So I think that we have a great perspective here. And also think that we should note that Mr. President of International PEN did find time to come to Ukraine. I must tell you that he does not go to every festival, but the very fact that he comes to Kiev, to Odessa, has a symbolic significance for the situation in which we find ourselves. I'd also like to add that over the last 2 years, the World PEN has adopted several resolutions to protect Ukrainian sovereignty and democracy, and they sided with the victims of the aggression of Russia. That's why we had several special conferences of PEN in Ljubljana and in Stockholm, and the topic of Ukraine has never vanished from the sight of the organizers. Can I go on for a bit? What are the major topics that are topical for Ukrainian literature? Is there any trend also in the world about most popular topics? Well, for instance, Mr. President said that we will talk about love. Do Ukrainian writers write about love or about dignity or about anything? Well, on behalf of Ukrainians, our literature is being changed now, and the topics are being changed, of course, and it is logical that Ukrainian authors now start to write about the war. And of course there is poetry about war, like Maria by Sergei Zhadan and some other stuff. I think that for several years we'll have some military topics which was not there in the entire post-independence Ukrainian literature. But of course there are other writers who will write about everyday things. So the main news for our literature now is that the Ukrainian battle literature is emerging these days.
I'm not an expert in this, but it seems to me that when you are in difficult circumstances, writers, without consulting each other, move quite naturally towards comedy, and in fact towards black comedy. And there's no question that the history of the last 10 years is a history of breakdown all over the world. I would say I'm just about to end my 6 years as president, and I have a very clear feeling that every month the situation of freedom of expression is getting worse. Every month the rise of racism, the return to the worst kind of what I call negative nationalism, 19th century negative nationalism, which people start pointing at other religions and other colors and saying things which are essentially old-fashioned 19th century European racist things, is coming back in a very big way. This is very dangerous times in many, many places, in many different ways. And so what you're seeing is this astonishing return of black comedy, which of course, pretty good example sitting right next to me here. I mean, I just finished not long ago the English translation of Death in the Penguin. It was in English, yeah. It's a classic example of edgy black comedy, right? And you know, I don't think 10 years ago this sort of thing was being written because there was a sense of some stability and optimism. And I think it's really interesting, we were talking about it as we walked over here, that this is, after all, a country, more or less, of Gogol and Bulgakov, two of the greatest masters in the Western civilization of black comedy. Gogol's my favorite writer, period, almost. Everything I write, I keep thinking about Dead Souls, because how funny and unforgiving can you be? I mean, he set the standard for it is impossible to go beyond how mean and unforgiving you can be while being very, very funny. So I think we're heading into a time when there's going to be more and more black comedy, or dark comedy, or whatever the right term is, I don't know in Ukrainian. And I think that's probably the right direction to be going in these days. And I wouldn't be at all surprised if it isn't I don't know if it's a trend here. Are you an exception to the rule, or is it probably? But you may not be for long. I don't know.
Yes, John made a very interesting observation. I hadn't thought about this, but now I see that our three best Ukrainian writers, not only Andriy Kurkov, but also Zhadan, is very ironic and sarcastic, and Andrukhovich as well. I would say that the Ukrainian literature of the past 2 decades has reached a certain high level of professionalism. Now, young writers can write about a lot of things and in different ways, but I'm still waiting for this quantity to become quality. We all await the bestowing of the Nobel Prize on a Ukrainian writer, although we do have already different international prizes. And Sergei Zhadan, for instance, is among 7 finalists of the so-called East European Nobel, and Oksana Zabushko and Yuri Andrukhovich were already laureates.
Thing which I think people would find interesting. About 3 years ago, we started an international prize. Many PEN centers have prizes in their countries, so we tend not to do it at the international level. And also, how do you make it fair when it's, have 150 PEN centers? So, was it 3 years ago, James? Yeah. So this is James Tennant, who runs all our literary programming in the International Secretariat. And we started a brand new prize called New Voices. And it's a prize which is aimed at young writers who have not yet been published. It can be 30 is the oldest you can be, right? And it's short texts, so it could be short stories, essays, poems, etc. But short texts, so you're not asking too much. And what happens is that each PEN center forms a jury of well-known writers in their country, of Ukrainian writers, for example. And they invite young people to submit, and then they jury it. It's pretty exciting, you've never been published, and here you have famous Ukrainian writers reading your stuff. It's what you dream of as a young person who wants to become a writer, getting somebody who's already a well-known writer to read something you've written. So that's what happens automatically when you apply. And then out of that, if there's the quality, they choose 2 winners of that PEN center. And one is a woman, and the other is a man. And those 2 are sent into James, and he has put together an international jury of writers who are extremely well known around the world. For example, this year, Jan Martel, Life of Pi, is on the jury. Who else? Who would the people know who's on the jury this year? Anamambanku, the great African Francophone writer. I mean, it's an amazing thing to think that here you are, 18 years old, you have never published anything, and 5 of the world's most famous writers are reading what you wrote. And even if you don't get into the final 3, which is what we do with a list of 3, you've still been read, and you might get some comments back. And then the 3 finalists are invited to the annual PEN Congress, and they become a little band of 3 young people, and they spend the whole week with 300, 400 writers. They go on stage with the members of the jury, and then near the end, the winner is announced. But by the time we announce the winner, actually the 3 almost don't care because they're so tied to each other. And what we've seen is that this has already produced most of the people in the finalists get published. In fact, the first winner, who's a young South African man, there's a film being made of his short story already. So it's a way of saying to young people, there's a way in. It's not, we can't help, hundreds get published, but it's a way to start getting young people into the system, which will lead to them becoming writers or perhaps journalists or whatever it is they become. But it's so I think it's something you might want to talk with Ukrainian PEN about and see if maybe some of the journalists can help get the word out so that young people, you were talking about how do you get outside of Odessa, how do you get the word out throughout Ukraine so that young people will come forward and apply for this prize?
Thank you. And we have a question.
Укрінформ, Національна інформаційна агенція. Я хочу запитати, тут пан...
The National Information Agency, Ukrinform, Mr. President told us about Sentsov, that if the Ukrainian PEN Club will do this, then the International PEN will campaign for the release of Sentsov. Are the Ukrainian... Well, we have already talked about this, and we are approaching the situation when we accept Oleg Sentsov as an honorary member of Ukrainian PEN, and so he automatically becomes a member of the PEN International, and then automatically his name is on the list of those unfortunate people who are in jail. But of course there's a prison committee in International PEN, and you know, they are not only engaged in demonstration, they organize sending thousands of letters to governments and presidents of those countries where writers are imprisoned. This is a very massive, very concentrated campaign that often leads to positive results.
We have to keep reinventing how to do it. I mean, we started out, it's quite interesting, just so you get a sense of this, you know about postcard campaigns and things. These are all things invented by PEN, and in the 50s and 60s. But our first campaign was during the Spanish Civil War in 1937-38, when the great playwright Garcia Lorca was arrested, and the great writer Arthur Koestler was arrested. And H.G. Wells was the president, one of my predecessors, and they organized the first ever campaign for the freeing of a writer. And for us, you know, in PEN, this is a sort of searing moment, because we succeeded in saving the life of Arthur Koestler. Literally, he was sitting in his jail cell. It was 2 hours before he was to be taken out to be shot by a firing squad. And the pressure was such that the Franco forces released him. And he was very funny about it later, because he was a very sort of calm guy. And curious enough, my wife interviewed him and said, well, what were you thinking about? And he said, I had the Times. I had a cigarette. I was smoking and reading the Times, waiting to be shot. You know, anyway, he's a very special guy. And then unfortunately, Garcia Lorca, we had a great campaign, but he'd been kidnapped by a wild group, and they just took him somewhere and shot him in a ditch. So our fight to save the lives of writers began with an amazing success and a tragic failure. And so we're always, you know, we have this in our mind all the time. Can we save this person's life? And every year we're getting people out of prison. But, you know, by talking about them, that often means that even if they're not released, if they need medication, they get medication. Their wife or husband can get in to see them. They're allowed to write. I mean, they're given decent food. There are all sorts of things that are not as good as being freed, but they are at least a life. It's a bit like Mandela, you know, or Aung San Suu Kyi, who was one of our big cases. I was able to see Aung San Suu Kyi last year, which was very moving, because I was, years and years ago, started the campaign for her when I was, I think, president of PEN Canada. But we're having to reinvent how to do it, and often when we go to see presidents and ministers, it's about the prisoners. When we were in Kyrgyzstan, Andriy was with me in Kyrgyzstan where we did the Congress last year, but before that we were in Kazakhstan. And we were able to see one of the 2 prisoners there and get some improvement in his conditions. We didn't do so well in Kyrgyzstan, but we had the president shout at us for 20 minutes, which is always a privilege. That's a joke. You know, you sit there politely while this guy shouts at you. And then you wait and you start talking about what needs to happen, and this person should really be released, and here's what we know, and so on. It is amazing how often we get people out, or at least keep them alive. So this is a case which, when it's formalized, we'll see what we can do in very tough conditions in Russia.
Thank you very much. У нас, на жаль, закінчується час. Вже потрібно.
Thank you very much. Regrettably, the time is running out. We have to release our famous speakers. Thank you very much for the presentation. See you later. Bye-bye.